known for centuries as the Holy Land. These are the hills and valleys of Israel, the land of the Bible. Mark D. Hahn and Jimmy DeYoung have returned to this biblical landscape, as they often have, to explore one geographically distinct and historically important region known as the Galilee, the setting for many of the Bible's most significant events and unfolding stories. Because Jerusalem is the anchor point of the Holy Land, they begin this day's journey on the Mount of Olives, which rises to the east of the city's historic center.
In the Bible, when you read about the different sections in New Testament times, you read about Judea, Samaria, and the Galilee. Everything from Jerusalem south to the Red Sea would be the area of Judea. And then from Jerusalem north to Nazareth, you have Samaria. And from Nazareth north to the Lebanese border, you have the Galilee, the Lower Galilee, the Upper Galilee, with the Sea of Galilee over here, and to the west, the Mediterranean, the Dead Sea here just outside of Jerusalem.
And we're headed today north. We're going to go out Route 1, hit Route 6, and then up to the Galilee. And as we do, we're actually going to be looking back in time to some of the people, the places, the events that make up it's the greatest story ever told.
We're going to have an opportunity to see much of this area, many places that'll be familiar to you as you hear about them, places you've read about in the Bible. For example, we'll stop at Megiddo. That was one of Solomon's chariot cities. It was on the trade route, the military route, leading out of Africa all the way over to Saudi Arabia, to Mecca. Then we'll make our way up to Mukraka. Maybe you've never heard of that, but Mount Carmel, that's the location where the prophet Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal. And then, of course, concluding our journey today over in Nazareth, hometown of Jesus Christ for some 28 years.
And really, Jim, all the places, the people you're talking about are like chapters of the story of the Bible, the history of the Bible, which, like our own journey together, is going to have a beginning, a journey, and a destination. What do you say, Jim? Should we go?
I'm going to let you fold the map. I'm no good at that at all.
Today's modern highways in Israel tend to obscure the fact that they often follow roads that have existed for thousands of years. Those ancient paths crisscross this small strip of land on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea that has, throughout most of human history, been merely the land between. The land between Africa, Asia, and Europe. The land between civilization's ancient superpowers, Egypt, Greece, Persia, and Rome. This region, known in pre-Roman ages as Canaan, was an area to be traveled through on the way to someplace else, until the God of a man named Abraham chose this land to tell the greatest story ever told. Only with the coming of the family of Abraham did the people of surrounding nations begin talking about astounding events that were happening here at the crossroads of the ancient world. Over the centuries that followed, this land bridge to other places became known by the remarkable events that occurred here. Here, according to the Bible, the Lord of an unlikely people showed himself to be the God of gods and the King of kings. Through a promised land, a chosen people, and a prophesied Messiah, the predicted blessing would come to all the nations of the world. And now, because of that still unfolding story, Jimmy and I headed north on the coastal plain, following one of antiquity's major interstate highways. This road came to be called the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea. This was the most traveled Middle Eastern trade route in and out of Egypt. The first stop on our journey to the Galilee would be at a strategic intersection along the Via Maris, the fortress city of Megiddo. But in order to reach Megiddo, we had to first go through the gateway to the Galilee, a pass in the Mount Carmel range.
The Mount Carmel range rises fairly abruptly off of the plain and out of the Mediterranean Sea, about 1,700 feet. And it forces traffic off the coast and somehow through the range into the Jezreel Valley. There are actually 3 passes, a northern one, a southern one, fairly broad, but a bit out of the way if you want to go directly to Megiddo, which is where the route wants to go. The central pass, the Megiddo Pass, of the 3, it's the most difficult, the narrowest at one point. The pass then opens up quite dramatically, Megiddo right at the point of it, the end of it. And it sits quite nicely on the edge of the valley.
We're here on the edge of the fertile fields of the Jezreel Valley, just outside of Tel Megiddo, and ancient gates that would have led into the city. A tell because over 20 different civilizations have been built one upon the other. And this ancient city dates back even to the time of the conquest of the land, 3,500 years ago, when Joshua would have brought the children of Israel in to conquer the promised land. This was one of the over 30 city-states that Joshua would have captured. Later, Solomon fortified the city. He made it one of his chariot cities, one of 3 that would be on the trade route leading from Africa on into Asia and into the Far East. And then this particular location has been talked about over the centuries as the spot where the armies of the world will gather. This Tel Megiddo overlooks the Jezreel Valley, where that final battle will take place in the future at the time of the return of the Messiah.
You know, you could come to a site like this and say, what have you got? You've got an ancient gate, got stone, got rubble. When you open the pages of the Bible, you find that we also have here a stage for an unfolding drama. And it's far greater. This story is far greater than that of kings and of power, of struggle and control. All of this is simply staging for a much greater story of a king, a great God who was using the men and women of this place to show the whole world that there is a power, there's a source of life far greater than anything that a human king could hold.
And so, according to the first book of the Bible, it all began when God led one of history's most important people out of Babylonia to this region, the man Abraham and his wife Sarah. Here the God of Genesis announced his plan to bring blessing to the whole world through the descendants of this childless couple who had long since passed the normal age of parenting. As Jimmy and I drove away from Tel Megiddo, we wound up the Carmel Ridge from the floor of the Jezreel Valley. Because the geography has not changed much over the centuries, it was easy to imagine garrisons of soldiers camped here, and lone sentries posted among the rugged limestone rocks and woodlands overlooking these roads and trails. Here too are rich green meadows and woodlands, benefiting from the moisture-laden air that sweeps uphill from the Mediterranean Sea and condenses on the western slope. Arriving at the summit of Mount Carmel, we entered the courtyard of a church built to commemorate a battle not for land, but a spiritual battle for the hearts and minds of the people of Israel.
Here on one of the highest mountain peaks on Mount Carmel, top of a rooftop of a church looking out across the Jezreel Valley towards Mount Gilboa. There's Mount Moreh, Mount Tabor, and just in the foreground before Mount Tabor, city of Nazareth, hometown of Jesus Christ. This is at the head of the Jezreel Valley, looking between these mountain ranges. You can see from here to the north the Galilee. In fact, in the distance, even the top of Mount Hermon, the top of the Upper Galilee, and down to the south towards Jerusalem, mountains of Samaria. As you make your way here to the other side of the rooftop, I believe it's probably the first time that I have ever seen from this vantage point the Mediterranean, so beautiful on this clear day. What a great, great place to be able to see, in fact, even the width of the state of Israel, from the Jordan Valley, the border to the east, all the way to the western border, located there at the Mediterranean Sea. A great vantage point to see this part of Israel, the beginnings of the Galilee.
From this vantage point, it's easy to see how the pass to Megiddo forms the Philistine gateway to the region of Galilee from the south. To the northwest is modern Akko, site of ancient Acre. It stood at the northern or Phoenician gateway to Galilee. Several miles to the east is the region's Jordan River gateway, providing access for monarchs, armies, and caravans coming up the King's Highway from Arabia through Edom, Moab, and Gilead, now modern Jordan. It's likely that this road is the one that the prophet Elijah traveled when he left his home in the hills of Gilead to deliver a message of judgment to Israel's king Ahab and his Phoenician queen Jezebel, a message that there would be no rain for 3.5 years. Expressing then the overriding story of the Bible, Elijah challenged their prophets and their god of thunder, called Baal, to a contest with the one true God.
The name of this location is Mukraka, an Arabic name that actually translated means the Mount of Burning, traditional site where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal. Jezreel is located out in the valley there. Ahab and Jezebel lived there, and she had housed and taken care of the prophets of Baal. And after 3.5 years of no rain, Ahab confronted the prophet Elijah, said, "Are you the one causing all the problems here in Israel?" Well, that led into a confrontation between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. Elijah allowing the prophets of Baal to set up their place of burning, to prepare their animal for the sacrifice, and to call upon their gods to bring down fire. After almost trying this all day long, they weren't able to have their gods respond to their request. Elijah then had everything removed, built his place of burning, had them soak it with 12 barrels of water, and then he called down fire from the heavens, devouring everything. The animal sacrifice, the stones, the water, everything. It's right after that that Elijah told them to take the prophets of Baal down to the Kishon Brook. And there, Elijah went down and killed all of these prophets of Baal.
If one stands at the site of Mukraka, this site that Elijah, according to tradition, at least in terms of its location, challenged the priests of Baal and Asherah, it's a quite dramatic drop to the north. From Mukraka, the hills just drop sharply down to what's called the Kishon Pass. In the Kishon Pass, in fact, according to the Book of Kings, this is where Elijah killed the priests of Baal and Asherah. And it's not surprising if you understand that event in its historical context and geographical context, because Phoenicia of that time came from what is today Lebanon all the way down to Mount Carmel. And so the Kishon Pass was the passage, the link between Phoenicia and Israel. It's through the Kishon Pass that this Baal worship entered into Israel. So in this symbolic gesture, Elijah slays the priests of Baal and Asherah in this valley.
The distance from the top of Mount Carmel to the Kishon Brook below is relatively short, but the route is steep. And in this beautiful light, in such a quiet setting, it's hard to imagine what happened near this spot. Elijah directing the execution of 400 prophets of Baal. And I try to imagine what was racing through the minds of the Israelites, having just witnessed fire coming down from heaven burning up an entire water-soaked altar, rocks and all. And now they're standing here watching this execution. I wonder if they finally remembered why they were the chosen people, why they were brought to this promised land. I wonder if they remember that they were here to shine the light of the one true God, rather than to be conquered by the darkness of surrounding pagan culture. From the banks of the Kishon to the north side of the Jezreel Valley is a short and straight drive. From the valley floor to Nazareth, however, the road becomes a steep and winding way, no doubt retracing a trail long ago terraced by the hooves of untold numbers of sheep and goats with their attending shepherds. Moist air flowing across the plain of Akko from the sea also condenses on these slopes, covering the springtime hills with wildflowers and new grass.
Now, from the base of that valley, the hills rise up again. Not as high as Mount Carmel. These are lower-lying hills, but these low-lying hills form, in fact, what we call Lower Galilee, which are the same hills on which Nazareth sits.
Okay, get out. Good. It's busy. Sunday afternoon here in Nazareth. These are Christian families having a picnic on a beautiful day. Not a cloud in the sky, Jim. In fact, look, there's the moon up there. In the middle of the day, you can see the moon. Look at those little kids.
We're going to have a wonderful view from here at the precipice, up the pathway here.
The Mount of the Precipice. It's just outside of Nazareth, right, Jim?
Yes, it is.
This Nazareth Ridge runs due east and west. If you're interested in going from Egypt to Mesopotamia, then you want to go around this ridge. It's too high to go up and over. You can either go around it on the western side, most went around it on the eastern side, and then continue your journey. This ridge is fairly isolated, you might say, by itself. It sticks up by itself. Valleys north and south, low points east and west. It rises steeply enough out of the Jezreel Valley that you wanted to stay off of it, unless you live there, unless you were a local.
At the time of Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, a little village of maybe 10 or 30 families, around 300, that would have lived in that city where the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, told her she would have the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus Christ. It was that same city that after the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem and then a trip into Egypt for almost a year, Mary and Joseph would have brought their young son back to Nazareth. Beautiful view from here, top the overlook, overlooking Nazareth, and in the valley below, the Jezreel Valley that extends all the way from the coast of Israel, the Mediterranean coast, across to the Jordan Valley. It's the lower border of the Galilee area.
Jesus, of course, grows up in Nazareth from the time he was maybe just old enough to walk until the time that he was, until the time was fulfilled, and his ministry would begin. Maybe altogether, 25 years, 28 years, something like that. And during those initial growing up years, they pass quickly in the gospel. We can only imagine what Jesus did, all sorts of things, in addition to just having a good time, walking among the hills and fields and valleys and so on. And he perches himself on the edge of the Jezreel Valley, at the edge of this Nazareth Ridge. It's quite a high precipice, a lookout, you might say. You can see forever from the top when the air is clear. Deep into Samaria, deep into Galilee, into Transjordan. Were it not for Mount Carmel, you could see the Mediterranean Sea. And as he looks into the Jezreel Valley, growing up as a kid, just out on a hike, going to Shabbat school, a religious education, knowing the stories of the past, his past, the Old Testament, recalling to mind over there on Mount Carmel where Elijah met, fought with, combated the prophets of Baal. Down at his feet he can see Mount Moreh and where the village of Shunem was, where Elisha went about doing good and raised a boy to life. the ministries of Elijah and Elisha very much just at his feet, you might say, where Gideon fought a great battle against the Midianites, where Deborah and Barak fought battles against Sisera and Jabin, king of Hatzor, these great redemptive acts of God at his feet. And you wonder how, as he reflected on the stories as they were told in the Bible and on other stories told about them in the oral tradition, then going up and looking at the land and putting the pieces in place, how this helped to shape his understanding of who he was as he grew in wisdom and stature in the favor of God and man. How this energized his idea of Redeemer and Savior.
I can just imagine, as a teenager into his 20s, Jesus Christ, maybe standing here at this same spot, looking down in the Jezreel Valley, anticipating the future, what would happen when those armies of the world do gather for that final battle, the Battle of Armageddon.
Something else happened here in Nazareth that really reflects the theme of the whole great story of the Bible. Gospel writer Luke tells us that Jesus, as a young man, went into the synagogue here in Nazareth, opened up the scriptures, and the people had commented that he speaks with such grace and such wisdom. And yet he read the scriptures in such a way that he made the hometown people furious with him. And then the Gospel of Luke tells us that they actually became so angry that they brought him to a precipice of the city. Traditionally, this is called the Mount of Precipice. We don't know for sure that this was the place, but it would have been a place like this, where in their anger, the people rejected Jesus. They rejected any thought that he could possibly be the anointed Messiah of God. Tried to throw him over the cliff, but the text says that he avoided them and he made his way through them and avoided their anger. But that event, right here, somewhere in these hills of Nazareth, reflects a recurring theme of the Bible. And that's the theme of rejection. The great creator, the great king who made this world is seen as coming into this world. First, he comes into the lives of men and women and speaks to them through prophets. And over again, the stories that we've been talking about today as we visited these sites, these stories reflect men and women rejecting their king, their creator, their Lord. And right here in Nazareth, the gospel writer Luke says it was Jesus. And the New Testament says that this wasn't just a man. This was the creator himself, the king, stepping into his own world, and he was rejected. Happens over and over in the greatest story of human history.
And because God became man here, each generation has the same choice. As the Apostle John wrote, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God.
Why do visitors from all over the world come here to stare reflectively into the past and future of these hills, this shoreline, and this valley? What still unfolding story connects the names of Abraham and Jesus to an Israeli landscape that was known in antiquity as Galilee of the Gentiles, and in the predictions of Jewish prophets as the place where the armies of the earth would gather in one great end-time battle? Whether you visited this land for yourself or dreamed of doing so, we invite you to join us for a road tour of the land and amazing story of the Bible, the Lower Galilee, on this day of discovery. This is the land of the Bible, Galilee, today a popular vacation spot for modern Israelis and a magnet to visitors from around the world. Here, modern highways still follow the paths of ancient roads that once connected the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, however, the horsepower of finely tuned engines replaces the footfall and clatter of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman chariots. Security has been a long-standing issue in the region. In ancient times, Assyrian and Babylonian armies invaded the land of Israel through this northern passage. Later, Arab Muslims, European Crusaders, and Turks clashed here. Today, the lakeshore city of Tiberias remains in the shadow of the looming and often contested Golan Heights on its eastern shore. And it is here on the shore of Lake Kinnereth, or the Sea of Galilee as it is known in the Bible, that Mark DeHaan and Jimmy DeYoung are getting ready for a day in the Lower Galilee to revisit some of the most important chapters of the greatest story ever told.
You know what? Those gulls remind me of Lake Michigan.
Except we're here on the Sea of Galilee, just outside of Tiberias, getting ready for our trip today.
Got a clear morning.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Hey, got the
Really is.
keys?
Certainly do. Would you
You
like
drive.
to drive?
No, you drive.
Okay. I tell you what, though, we better go over how we're going to make our journey here. Get the old faithful map out. Mart, do you? Yeah. Here we are. Now we're basically right here at Tiberias. Come down, start into the Jordan Valley going south.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm. This is where the Jordan River comes out, and this is the Jordan Valley. Make our way down here to the location of Mount Gilboa, actually the location where the first king of Israel, King Saul, and his 3 sons were killed by the Philistines. Then we turn right, go west. This is actually a strategic junction right here too, because you've got the Jordan Valley, you have the Jezreel Valley they come in perpendicular to each other. So we start west, we make our way over to Tel Jezreel, another king of Israel, Ahab. And you heard about Jezebel, haven't you?
I've heard about Jezebel.
Elijah and all the confrontation they had there. Then across the beautiful, fertile fields of the Jezreel Valley, up towards and then into the mountains of Nazareth, and then over here to Cana of Galilee. Then make our way across back towards Tiberias and come to the Arbel Pass. So beautiful as you enter into the Sea of Galilee.
Okay, and then back to Tiberias,
Yes,
right? Okay, and the reason we're doing this, because all of these events that Jim has just described are like chapters in a great story. And what's interesting about this story is that it's about a bigger story that's been lost. But right here in Israel, that story can be found. And Jim and I are gonna walk with you through that unfolding great story of history today together. You ready?
Yes, sir.
Let's go for it.
You fold the map and I'll
Okay,
get ready
I
to
got it.
drive.
Because of Galilee's fertile land, its location at the crossroads of many ancient highways, and its great freshwater lake, it was always a strategic military hotspot for clashing nations and occupying armies. For that reason, it was known in Bible times as Galilee of the Gentiles, or Galilee of the Nations. This region was a place in Israel where breaking news would travel not only to Jewish homes, but to the outside world as well.
In terms of openness for people moving through, and so on, the Galilee is the best. That is to say, the Galilee has this great series of east-west, broad, flat, low valleys, doorways, you might say, by which you can go from the sea route to the land route most easily, bypassing a lot of the obstacles. That happens to be the Galilee. In particular, it happens to be the Jezreel Valley, the great crossroads, you might say, of antiquity in this part of the world, and to a lesser extent, some of the other valleys of the Galilee. It's not an accident that Isaiah called this region in Isaiah 9, verse 1, the Galilee of the Gentiles, or the Galilee of the nations.
The name Galilee appears to come from a Hebrew word meaning to encircle. And we know it also from the Bible as being the Galilee of the Gentiles. And certainly in Jesus' day, Galilee was an area where there were a high population of Gentiles. This is essentially an area that is bordered by the Litani River in the north, which is in Lebanon, southern Lebanon today. At the southern end, you have the Jezreel Valley. On the west, you have the Mediterranean Sea. And on the east, you have the Jordan Valley. So these four main geographical features more or less outline the biblical Galilee. You can divide it easily into two portions. What's known as Upper Galilee, where all the elevations are 3,000 feet and higher, and Lower Galilee, where all the elevations are about 2,000 feet and lower. And in Lower Galilee, you have, for example, Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. And from Nazareth, you can look out over the hills and you can see really how low-lying these mountains are compared to the higher uplifted region of Upper Galilee beyond in the north. And on a clear day, you can see Upper Galilee from good points of view in Nazareth.
Biblically, the boundaries are a little bit more flexible, you might say, and they tend to ebb and flow depending on which local power happens to be here. In the time of the New Testament, the word Galilee was very specific. It was a district on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, including a very small portion of the Jezreel Valley, including a series of ridges going east and west, running north of the Jezreel Valley, or laying north of the Jezreel Valley, and some higher hills to the north of that, but did not include anything toward the coast. A district that was governed by a fellow named Herod Antipas. The district of Galilee is the way it's described technically in the Gospels.
We've come up from the Jordan Valley on our journey today, here to the mountain range known as Mount Gilboa, which is the border for the Jezreel Valley here in the southeastern section of it, where the Jordan Valley and the Jezreel Valley come together. On this mountain ridge, someplace along here, the Bible story that took place 3,000 years ago of the first king of Israel, King Saul, meeting his death when under attack from the Philistines. Here it was that King Saul, his 3 sons were killed. And later, the Philistines took them to the community down in the valley there, Bet Shan, and attached their bodies to the wall.
The Philistines had come all the way up through the Jezreel Valley to separate the northern and southern tribes of Israel and choke Israel, the northern and southern tribes from each other, isolate them, and really take over the Egyptian presence that had been there previous, all the way to Beit Shan. And Beit Shan, a rather large Canaanite city-state, like Megiddo, by the way, lying right there where the Jezreel Valley system dumps out into the Rift Valley. In the time of the New Testament, it had a Hellenistic name, the site, Skytopolis, and was becoming a rather large and impressive Hellenistic Decapolis city with all the elements that you would have in Rome itself: theaters, cardos, hippodromes, Roman baths, columns, the whole bit.
It's interesting watching a little calf suckle from his mother here on the Gilboa Range. If you think about it, the calf is sometimes smarter than we are. We can so easily forget who our provider is and our purpose for being here. In fact, that's what the story of the Bible is all about.
Saul and his sons lost their lives right around here somewhere. And why? Because they were part of a nation, part of a family that had forgotten the big story, where they had come from, why they were here, and where they were going. And the result was tragic. You have to ask the question, why does a good book tell us stories like this? I think it's because our source, our Creator, wants us to sit and reflect, to live and to reflect about where we came from and what this journey called life is all about and where it's going. That's what the story of Saul and his death on Mount Gilboa is all about. He had forgotten the big story. He'd worshipped himself. He'd been far more concerned about protecting himself and trying to make provisions for his own rule than entrusting the God, the great king who had given him his position of leadership in Israel. That's not just, these aren't just events. This is part of the greatest story ever told, and it's for us to reflect on what it all means for us.
While reflecting on the death of Saul and his sons here on the slopes of Gilboa, a group of Israeli mourners parked their cars along the road and gathered for the burial of a loved one. What kind of meaning was there in the life and death of the one being buried here today? As I watched the funeral procession form in the distance, it seemed like the reality of Saul's tragic death was being reenacted before us. While many years separated us from the death of the father and sons who died in this mountain, I knew I wasn't far removed from the same attitudes that brought Saul to such a bitter end.
The prophet Samuel said to Saul, "You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." 1 Samuel chapter 15.
Yes, in many ways what happened to Saul and his sons here on this mountain is a story about another family living a long time ago. And yet in the quiet of this Galilee overlook, I also sensed that what happened here was giving me today a vision of God and a new look into my own heart. From the Philistine killing fields of Mount Gilboa, Jimmy and I headed toward another overlook of the Jezreel Valley, the apparent location of history's last chapters in the final battle between the forces of good and evil, Armageddon.
The Jezreel Valley is a very expansive valley, very flat, tends to get waterlogged. Nowadays the water is channeled, the valley is dried out to the extent that the whole thing can be used for agriculture. And even though it's the agricultural breadbasket of Israel today, we can say the same thing about biblical times. Even though all of it might not have been usable, enough of it was. In fact, King Herod appropriated the valley as his own estate, his own landed estate, in the time of the Gospels. He's the king, he can do what he wants. He takes the best.
It didn't take us long to descend from the wildflower-covered heights of Mount Gilboa to Tel Jezreel, lying on a low western spur of the mountain.
The point where the Jezreel Valley itself dumps out through the narrow pass down to Beit Shan is a strategic spot. There is a site there, an ancient site there called Jezreel, Tel Jezreel, the modern name. This is a juncture point, an important trade point as well. It was here that King Ahab built a palace for himself, a winter palace. The weather is nicer here than in his regular palace in the hill country of Samaria during the winter time. Built a nice fortified palace. People were attracted to the palace, started to live up next to it, and the town started to grow.
The dig taking place here has been a slow, painstaking effort to find physical links to the notorious Jewish king Ahab, who built his winter palace here. Ahab was one of the northern kings of Israel who ruled the regions of Samaria and Galilee after 10 of the northern tribes seceded from the southern kingdom of Judah. Today I have some of the same feelings about Ahab that I did standing on Gilboa. The biblical record tells us that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all of the kings of Israel before him. Ahab repeated the mistakes of Saul, and like the first king of Israel, brought pain and disgrace not only on himself, but on the family and nation that depended on him. Somewhere to the east of here in the mountains of Gilead, Ahab bled to death in battle. And right here in Jezreel, Jezebel, Ahab's Phoenician wife, came to her own terrible end, being thrown from the tower of their winter palace. As prophesied by Elijah, Jezebel's body literally went to the dogs. I'll have to admit it was much easier for Jimmy and me to reflect on how this fertile valley has been Israel's breadbasket since Bible times. The meaning for the Hebrew word Jezreel fits its setting. It means God will sow the seed. Not the fertility god Baal worshipped by Ahab and Jezebel, but rather the one true God, who in so many ways chose the region of the Galilee to reveal himself as the King of Kings.
This is a wheat field here in the Jezreel Valley, the arrowhead-shaped valley between the mountains of Gilboa and Carmel, mountains of Nazareth. In fact, the cities that surround this valley give the significance of how important this piece of real estate is. In biblical times, this was a crossroads for the travelers, the tradesmen, the military coming out of Egypt on their way to Mesopotamia. This actually is going to be the crossroads to the world, according to Bible prophecy. The book of Revelation talks about all the nations of the world gathered here in the Jezreel Valley for that battle of Armageddon.
The drive from Tel Jezreel to our next location in Lower Galilee was marked by contrast. Not only were we moving from the valley floor up into the hills, but now we were also moving across hundreds of years to the hometown of a far different kind of king. Road signs to our destination confirmed that we were driving into the hills of the hometown of Jesus of Nazareth. From hills that Jesus must have played on as a boy, we stared into the fertile and prophetically significant Jezreel Valley below. History, present, and future all merged here in ways far greater than I could absorb. What also impressed me was how different Nazareth was from the small village that Jesus had grown up in. Modern Nazareth had spread down its slopes to virtually encompass what used to be a separate town, the town of Cana.
This is the modern-day city of Cana, a Galilean village in the times of Jesus Christ, just down the slopes from Nazareth, west of Tiberias, where we started our journey this morning. The Bible records in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, a very famous wedding took place here. In fact, here in Cana of Galilee, there are several locations, the traditional sites for that wedding. Jesus Christ and his disciples visited that wedding here in Cana of Galilee.
We find Jesus opening his ministry at Cana, where he goes to a wedding. The site of Cana has been suggested to be in two different locations. You could say the church traditional site, where the Byzantine churches and so on were located, is on the slope of the Nazareth Ridge. The city of Cana is there today, a modern city called Cana. And the other possibility is just a tell on not much excavation. Nobody lives there today. It's on the outside of a rather large Arab village, Kafar Manda.
It was here that Jesus Christ performed the first of many miracles during his public ministry. Jesus Christ and his disciples visited that wedding feast, the celebration going on here in Cana of Galilee, and he turned the water into wine. Cana of Galilee, famous for a very important wedding.
The nicest section of Lower Galilee, other than the sea itself, is a valley lying just north of the Nazareth Ridge. Today it's called the Beit Netophah Valley. It was centered around, you could say, centered around the city of Sepphoris in the time of the New Testament. Hanathon was the Old Testament site, gathering up the valley. And it's a valley mostly of towns and villages, agriculture, small village agriculture, that sort of thing. Jesus, as he would wander as a youth and as a young adult, probably not only gazed into the Jezreel Valley, but into this northern Beit Netophah Valley as well. We find him telling parables later on in life, many of which are centered on village life, agricultural life, a farmer sowing seed, village women looking for lost coins, that kind of thing, landed tenants, absentee landlords, those sorts of things. And all of that has a setting, you could say, in this Lower Galilee area and these agricultural valleys, the small towns.
As we leave behind our all too brief visit to Nazareth and Cana, the significance of what the gospel writers say happened here lingers. It was in Nazareth that Jesus grew up in obscurity. It was in Nazareth that he announced in the local synagogue that the long-awaited Messiah had come. And it was just down the road in Cana that, according to the gospel account, he did the first of so many miracles. Combined with the amazing claims he made about himself, those miracles led so many in his day to realize that madmen and liars don't heal shriveled legs or turn water into wine. From Cana, we drove east toward the Sea of Galilee, just one day's walk in Jesus' time, to our final destination, the Arbel Pass.
As one approaches the Arbel Pass from the direction of Nazareth, one has to keep in mind that to get down to the Sea of Galilee, you're going to drop down very deep in elevation, because the Sea of Galilee itself sits in a very deep trough known as the Jordan Valley, which is a part of the Great Syro-African Rift. So what that means is that you're going to be making a very dramatic drop down to the Sea of Galilee. And you see this as you approach the pass. You can, from the top, already see the hills of the Golan Heights in the distance, and you can see the big drop down to the Sea of Galilee.
We've come full circle today on our journey, starting on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, making our way south down the Jordan Valley to where the Jezreel Valley comes in to these two unique valleys here in the land of Israel, and then up to Mount Gilboa, the site where Saul met his death, his sons. Many locations as we travel through the Jezreel Valley, stopping there in the fertile fields, going over then to Cana of Galilee and the other sites that we were able to see as we've traveled together. Coming back now here to the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee through the Arbel Pass behind me. Most likely the travel route that Jesus and his disciples would have made from Nazareth, his hometown, into the 3.5-year location of his public ministry there in Capernaum.
In many ways, the story of the Bible, the great story of history, is like a trip. As a beginning, as a journey, as an end. In the middle, there's a great sense of loss. And as we've seen today, as we've talked about some of the tragic moments of human history, we've also been reminded that it was moving toward a time when a man would walk through this valley, down to the shores of Galilee, called men and women to himself, to listen to him, to follow him. He's still doing it today. That story is not complete because there's still a promised restoration of all things, a return to Eden, and an invitation for each one of us to be a part of that happy ending. Choice is ours. We're still a part of that journey. We're still moving. Something for all of us to think about.